They put a price on her head in broad daylight, not because she owed anyone a single cent, but because she had nowhere left to run. A woman who came west looking for a second chance got something else entirely. A crowd of strangers deciding what she was worth, and a town that had learned a long time ago to look the other way. This is the story of Clara Whitmore, the woman they auctioned, the woman they underestimated, and the woman who made every last one of them regret it. Watch until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach rolled into Black Hollow just past noon on a Thursday, and the first thing Clara Whitmore noticed was how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet. Not the kind of quiet that settles over a town when the wind dies down and the afternoon heat pushes everyone indoors for an hour. This was the other kind. The kind where people were watching but pretending not to. Where conversations stopped a half-second too early. Where men sitting outside the saloon turned their heads just slightly away when the coach pulled up, as if they'd already decided they didn't want to be caught looking. Clara felt it before she could name it. A prickling along the back of her neck, up under the damp hair at her collar, the way a rabbit freezes in tall grass, not because it sees the hawk, but because something in its blood already knows. She smoothed the front of her dress, dark blue wool, too heavy for the heat, the best she owned, and told herself she was being foolish. She was tired. She'd been on that coach for 11 days, the last 4 of which had been across terrain that jolted her spine with every rut and rock, and she hadn't slept properly in longer than that. Of course, everything felt off. Everything felt off when you were bone-tired and dry-mouthed, and your legs had gone half-numb from sitting. She gathered her traveling bag, one bag, everything she owned that was worth carrying, and climbed down from the coach without waiting for anyone to offer a hand. Nobody did. Black Hollow was not what the advertisement had described. She'd read that letter so many times she could still recite pieces of it from memory. A well-established homestead, a modest but comfortable dwelling, a man of honest character seeking a capable woman for partnership in building a proper household. That was the phrase that had gotten her. Partnership. Not a servant, not a housekeeper hired under a different name. A partner. She'd been practical enough to know that frontier marriages were rarely romantic arrangements, that they were about labor and survival and practical necessity as much as anything else. She hadn't expected poetry. She hadn't expected much tenderness at all, but she had expected honesty. The town's main street was maybe 200 yards long. A general store, a land office, a saloon that looked like it had been built fast and never properly finished, a livery at the far end, a handful of other storefronts with sun-bleached signs she couldn't read from where she stood. The buildings were the color of old bone. Dust had crept up every wall to knee-height like a slow tide. There were horses tied at rails here and there, a few wagons, a dog lying flat in a wedge of shade that was already shrinking as the sun moved overhead. Clara stood on the street with her bag at her feet and looked for the man she'd come to meet. His name was Roy Callum. The letter had told her that much. A rancher, property east of town, been working the land for 12 years and looking to settle things properly before another winter came. The letter had been written in a fair hand, the sentences straightforward and plain. She'd liked that. She'd written back in the same tone, not dressing it up. She'd been honest about herself, including things most women in her position wouldn't have led with. Her age, 28. Her circumstances? No family left. Working as a seamstress in a boarding house in Caldwell, money running out slower than hope, but still running out. Her appearance, I am a plain woman, Mr. Callum, and not a small one. I am not delicate, and I won't pretend otherwise, but I work hard and I don't quit, and I think that is worth something. He had written back. He'd said it was worth plenty. She scanned the street again. A man was walking toward her from the direction of the general store. Middle-aged, broad in the chest, with a hat pulled low and a leather vest that had seen better years. He wasn't smiling, but men out here rarely did. That wasn't what made her uneasy. It was the way he walked, measured, like someone crossing a room to deliver news they'd rehearsed. "You the one come on the noon coach?" he asked, stopping a few feet away. "I am," Clara said. "Clara Whitmore. I'm looking for Roy Callum." The man looked at her for a moment. Just looked, the way people sometimes did when they were deciding how to say something and trying to figure out how much of the truth they had to give. Then he pushed his hat back on his head and exhaled through his nose. Roy's not coming, he said. Clara felt the words land somewhere in her chest. Not quite pain, not yet. Excuse me? He sent word this morning, said he'd changed his mind. The man glanced at her bag, then back up at her face. Said he didn't, that the arrangement wasn't going to suit him. She stood there for a moment in the sun, with the dust and the stillness and the sound of a horse shifting its weight somewhere behind her. She'd prepared herself for a lot of things on that coach ride. A hard man, a rough house, cold winters and harder work and a marriage that would be more labor than love. She'd steeled herself for all of it, packed it into something she could carry. She hadn't prepared for this. He changed his mind, she said. That's what he said. Without telling me beforehand, without... She stopped. She pressed her lips together. Is there a telegraph office? Not here. Nearest one's in Harrow, 40 miles west. A boarding house, then. Somewhere I can... Miss Whitmore. The man said it with a kind of flat finality, like he was closing a door. I don't think you understand the situation. She looked at him fully then. Then explain it. He didn't answer immediately. He just looked past her, over her shoulder, and something in his expression shifted, like a man who's realized the thing he was dreading has already started without him. Clara turned around. There were 4 men coming up the street toward her, not rushing, not threatening in any overt way, but moving with that particular deliberate quality that powerful men adopt when they've already decided how something is going to go, and they're simply arriving to make it official. The one in front was dressed better than the others, a dark coat despite the heat, a silver chain across his vest, boots that had been cleaned that morning. He was maybe 50, lean through the face, with pale eyes that had the quality of a sky before rain, colorless and flat and full of pressure. Behind him were 2 men Clara didn't have names for yet, broad, watchful, positioned like brackets. And behind them, she noticed now, a small crowd had begun to form on the edges of the street, people drifting in from doorways, not quite gathering, not quite leaving. The man in the dark coat stopped in front of her. Miss Whitmore, he said. His voice was smooth and unhurried, the voice of a man who never needed to raise it. I'm Aldous Crane. I handle business interests in this town, among other things. He gestured vaguely at the street, as if he owned the gesture itself. I believe you arrived expecting to meet Roy Callum. I did, Clara said, and I've been told he's changed his mind. That's correct. Crane looked at her with an expression that might have been sympathy and wasn't. The problem, I'm afraid, is a practical one. The cost of your passage was advanced. Coach fare, lodging along the route, the advertisement itself. Roy arranged those funds on credit, and now that the arrangement has dissolved, the debt falls to the party who received the benefit. That would be you. Clara went very still. I didn't ask anyone to advance me anything, she said carefully. I paid my own way from Caldwell. Whatever arrangement Roy Callum made, I have the paperwork right here. Crane produced a folded document from inside his coat. He didn't offer it to her. He just held it, tapping it lightly against his palm. $63, Miss Whitmore, a considerable sum. Now, I understand you're in a difficult position, and I'm not an unreasonable man. That's not my debt, Clara said. Whatever he signed, I didn't sign it. You can't... Under the terms of the frontier commerce agreements this county operates under, Crane said, still in that same easy voice. The receiving party assumes the obligation in default cases. It's all quite legal. He folded the document back and tucked it away. And since you don't appear to have $63 on your person, you don't know what I have. We have to find another way to settle the matter. He glanced at one of the men behind him, just briefly. The town handles these situations through a settlement process, a public arrangement. Whatever you can contribute in service and labor is applied against the debt until it's cleared. Clara looked at him. She looked at the document pocket where he'd returned the paper. She looked at the crowd that had grown, quietly, without anyone seeming to move. There were maybe 30 people on the street now, not quite watching, not quite looking away. She understood then. Maybe she'd understood from the moment the man came across the street to tell her about Roy. Maybe some part of her had understood from the coach, from the quiet, from the way the town felt wrong in her bones before she'd even stepped down into the dust. You're going to auction me, she said. Crane's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind his eyes shifted. A small recalibration. The look of a man who'd expected more struggle before this part and wasn't quite sure how to feel that he wasn't getting it. "It's a debt settlement procedure," he said. "Quite standard." "It's an auction," Clara said. "You're going to stand me up in front of these people and sell my labor to whoever bids highest, and you're going to call it something else so it sounds like business." A man near the edge of the crowd coughed. Nobody else moved. Crane looked at her for a moment. "I'd encourage you to think carefully about how you proceed, Miss Whitmore. You're new here. You don't know how things work. The men I represent have a great deal of patience, but it isn't unlimited." "Neither is mine," Clara said. She meant it as a line she could stand behind. She meant it as the thing you say when you have nothing else. But even as she said it, she felt the reality of her situation pressing in from every side. $63 she didn't owe and couldn't prove she didn't owe. No telegraph, no way back, 40 miles to anywhere, one bag and the dress on her back, and a town full of people who were looking through her like she was already something that had been decided. They did it in front of the general store. Crane's men pushed a wooden crate to the edge of the boardwalk, and someone, she never caught who, told her to stand on it. Clara didn't move for a moment. She stood in the street with her bag still in her hand and the sun bearing down on the back of her neck, and she looked at the crate, and she thought about what it meant to step up onto it. Then she put her bag down, set it carefully upright so nothing would spill, and stepped up. Because the alternative was being put up there by someone else's hands, and she wasn't going to give them that. She was not a small woman. She knew that, had known it her whole life, had lived inside the fact of it in a world that noticed loudly and forgave nothing. She was tall and wide through the shoulders and full through the body in a way that drew eyes and comments in equal measure. She'd spent years learning to hold herself in a way that didn't apologize, though some days it was easier than others. Standing on that crate, above the crowd that had gathered fully now, 40 people, maybe more, pressed along both sides of the street, she held herself the way she'd learned. Straight spine, chin level, eyes open. Let them look. She'd been looked at before. Crane stood to the side, not in front of her but adjacent, like a man who wanted the authority without the visibility. One of his associates, a younger man with a flat face and the permanent squint of someone used to lying in daylight, stepped forward with a paper in his hands. "Debt settlement proceeding for one Clara Whitmore," the man said, loud enough to carry, in the bored tone of someone reading a grocery list. $63 outstanding. Labor and service to be applied toward full settlement. Bidding opens at 1 month's placement. From the crowd, a voice, casual, not cruel, which was somehow worse than cruelty. "She don't look like much." Laughter. Not universal, but enough. Clara kept her eyes forward. She picked a spot on the far end of the street, a gap between two buildings where she could see a strip of open land beyond the town's edge, flat and pale under the afternoon sky, and she looked at it and kept looking at it. 2 months, someone said. 2 and board. 3 months, light duties. She heard the voices without turning toward them. She heard them the way you hear rain on a roof when you're inside. The fact of it all around you, the wet weight of it, but not quite touching. 4 months, full duties. The bidding moved in the flat business-like tones of men who had done this before. And that was the thing that hit her hardest. Not any single voice, not the laughter, not the word placement used in place of the word that meant what it meant. It was the ordinariness of it, the routine quality, the way nobody in that crowd seemed to think anything unusual was happening, the way some of them had brought their children. She thought about the letter, a man of honest character. She thought about the coach ride, 11 days of dust and lurching, and the particular loneliness of traveling towards something you hope will be better than what you're leaving. She thought about the word partner. 6 months. A different voice this time, older, graveled, from somewhere to her left. 6 in room, she breathed. In through the nose, slow, out through the mouth, slower. Her hands were at her sides and she was not going to let them shake. And they were not going to shake, and they didn't. The bidding had slowed. The young man with the paper was saying something about finalizing terms when Clara heard boots on the boardwalk behind her. Not from the crowd, from the other direction. Deliberate footsteps that didn't hurry. She didn't turn around. But Crane did. She noticed because she was watching Crane, had been watching him the whole time with the peripheral attention of someone trying to understand where the danger actually lives. And when those footsteps came up behind her, something crossed Crane's face. Something that wasn't quite fear, but was what lived next door to it. A tightening. A reassessment. The footsteps stopped. A man moved into her field of vision. Not in front of her, not demanding her attention, but standing off to the left, one shoulder against the post of the general store's overhang, arms folded. He was tall, lean through the hips, wearing clothes that had been worn hard and cleaned enough. A dark hat, tilted. A face that was more angles than softness, with a few days of beard and eyes that were doing the work eyes do when a man's trying to read something without being seen doing it. He was looking at Crane. Crane looked back at him for a moment, and whatever passed between them, Clara couldn't name it, couldn't hear it. It was the kind of exchange that happens in silence between men who know each other's weight, seemed to flatten the air between them. Then the man's eyes moved just briefly to Clara. She didn't look away, she didn't know why, but she held his gaze for the 2 seconds it lasted, and then he looked back at Crane, and Crane looked at the young man with the paper, and the young man cleared his throat. "Bidding closed," he said. 6 months, room included, settled to Mr. Harlan Bess. A stout man near the front of the crowd raised a hand in acknowledgement. He didn't look at Clara when he did it. Clara stepped down from the crate. Nobody stopped her. Nobody helped her either, but she didn't want help, and her legs were steadier than she'd expected them to be, which was the small private victory she was going to allow herself for now. She picked up her bag. Crane was walking toward her with the paperwork. The official fiction of the debt settlement, the document she was supposed to sign that would make the whole arrangement legal on paper. "Miss Whitmore," he said. She took the paper from him. She read it. She read all of it, slowly, making him stand there while she did, which she could tell he didn't like from the way his weight shifted after the first minute. The document was careful. She'd give it that. It was the work of a man who'd done this enough times to know how to make exploitation read like procedure. Service and labor and satisfaction of outstanding debt. Terms of not less than 6 months. Conditions as agreed between parties. She looked up from it. "And if I don't sign? Then you're in breach of the debt settlement," Crane said, "which makes you a debtor in default, which means the sheriff can hold you until the matter is resolved. That could take some time." "The sheriff," Clara said. "He works for you." "The sheriff enforces the law," Crane said pleasantly. Clara looked at the paper again. She looked at the line where her name was supposed to go. She thought about $63 that wasn't her debt, and a man named Roy Callum who'd never shown up, and 11 days on a coach, and a crowd of people who'd watched a woman get auctioned in the street and mostly thought it was the natural order of things. She signed the paper. Not because she was beaten. She signed it because she was standing in a town she didn't know, with no money and no allies and no telegraph and no way out. And signing the paper bought her time. Time was the thing she could work with. Crane took the document back with the expression of a man who'd expected more drama and wasn't sure whether to be relieved or disappointed. "Mr. Bess will show you to his establishment," he said. "He runs the laundry on the south end." "I know what a laundry is," Clara said. Crane tucked the paper away. "Good day, Miss Whitmore." He turned and walked back toward the land office, his 2 men falling in behind him like shadows that had learned to walk upright. The crowd began to disperse the way crowds do when the show is over. Not all at once, but in the gradual peeling away of individuals who have other things to get back to. A woman in a calico dress ushered 2 small children past without looking at Clara. A merchant in an apron went back inside his store. The dog in the wedge of shade had moved, she noticed. The shade had moved too far. Harlan Bess was standing a few feet away, not rushing her, which she supposed was meant to pass for consideration. He was a heavy man, not especially tall, with the ruddy, watery-eyed look of someone who'd been working around hot water and steam for so long it had gotten into his face. He was holding his hat in his hands and turning it by the brim. "I run a clean operation," he said when she looked at him. It's laundry work, washing, pressing, delivery some days. I got a room above the shop. It's small, but it's clean." "How many people work for you?" Clara asked. 2 girls. 3 now, I suppose." "Do they get paid?" Bess looked at her, then at the ground, then back up at her. They get room and board. Do they get paid? Clara said again. Miss Whitmore. I'm going to be clear with you, Mr. Bess, Clara said. Her voice was even. She wasn't angry. Anger was a luxury she couldn't afford right now, which didn't mean she wasn't storing it carefully away for later. I signed a piece of paper that Aldous Crane produced because I didn't have a choice at this moment in time. That doesn't mean I signed away my judgment or my voice. I'll do the work. I'll do it well, because I do everything well. But I'm not going to pretend that what happened today was reasonable, and I'm not going to be quiet about the fact that it wasn't. Bess turned his hat, another revolution. You're going to have a hard time here, he said. I expect so, Clara said. I've had a hard time most places. I'm still here. She picked up her bag and waited for him to show her which direction to walk. The laundry was exactly what she'd been told. Clean, steamy, functional, the kind of place that smells of lye soap and iron-heated linen before you're even through the door. The room above it was small and plain. A cot, a washstand, a window that looked out on the alley between the laundry and the building next door. The window didn't open all the way, stuck at about 8 inches, but through it she could hear the sounds of the town. Horses, the occasional raised voice, the irregular percussion of daily life. She set her bag on the cot and sat down next to it and let herself be still for a few minutes. This was a thing she'd learned a long time ago. You couldn't carry everything forward at the same time. The things that had already happened, Roy Callum, the stagecoach, the crate, the crowd, the bidding voices, those were behind her now, and she couldn't undo them. She could be angry about them, and she would be, in the private way she allowed herself, but she couldn't let them be the first thing in the room every morning, or they'd eat the part of her she needed in order to think. She thought about the man with the dark hat, the one who'd stood against the post of the general store and looked at Crane in that way that made Crane's face do something complicated. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know what it meant that Crane had looked at him the way he had. She didn't know if it meant anything at all. Maybe he was just a man Crane owed money to, or a man Crane was afraid of for personal reasons that had nothing to do with her, but she filed it away. The way he'd stood, not intervening, not announcing himself, just present in a way that cost Crane something. That was information. She didn't know yet what kind. She heard footsteps on the stairs outside her door, light and quick. A knock. Then, without waiting, Mr. Bess said you arrived. The girl who pushed the door open was maybe 19, thin through the wrists, with dark hair pinned up haphazardly and ink-dark eyes that moved fast. The eyes of someone who's learned to read rooms quickly. She had a small scar at the edge of her chin that she didn't try to hide. I'm Delia, she said. She looked at Clara with the frank assessment of someone who doesn't have the luxury of being polite about it. You're the one they auctioned today. I am, Clara said. Delia leaned against the door frame. How bad is it? The debt. $63, that isn't mine. They do that, Delia said with the flat acceptance of someone reporting the weather. Callum's done it before. He orders the woman, runs up the charges, tells Crane he's not interested, and Crane collects the debt. They split whatever they get out of the placement fee. Clara looked at her. You know this. Everybody knows it. Nobody says it. Why not? Delia looked at her like the answer was obvious, and then seemed to decide that the obviousness was only obvious if you'd been here long enough. Crane owns the land office. He controls the water rights on the east side of town. He's got Judge Pell in his pocket, and Pell signs whatever Crane puts in front of him. The sheriff, Holt, has been on Crane's payroll since before most people here can remember. She paused. So when you say, why not say it, there's your answer. There's nobody to say it to. Clara sat with that for a moment. Where are you from? She asked. Ohio, Delia said. Same way you got here almost. Different man, same scheme. How long have you been here? 8 months. Delia pushed off the door frame and straightened up. My debt was $42. I've paid off about 12 of it, with the way they account things. She said the last few words with a precise bitterness, like she was measuring them out. Clara understood. The accounting would be designed to be slow. That was the machinery of it. The debt was never meant to be paid, only owed. There's supper downstairs in an hour, Delia said. Bess isn't cruel. He's weak, which is different. He doesn't like any of this, but he likes money more than he dislikes it, so. She shrugged. There's worse placements. Is there a third girl? Clara asked. You said there were two before me. Something shifted in Delia's face. Not quite grief, but a relative of it. Nora. She's sick. Been sick 3 weeks. No. The heat and the steam from the irons, it got into her lungs. She's not working. Is she getting care? Doc Yunt comes by every few days. He does what he can. Does Crane count her debt while she's too sick to work? The look on Delia's face answered the question. Clara nodded slowly. She pressed her hands flat on her knees, feeling the roughness of the wool fabric, and looked at the window and the strip of dusty sky visible through it. She had $63 to work off at a rate designed to never reach zero. She was in a town controlled by a man who had turned exploitation into paperwork. She had no money, no allies, no legal standing, and a signature on a document that gave the whole arrangement a coat of paint that looked like law. She had her mind. She had her hands. She had whatever she could learn about this place and the people in it, and she was going to learn as much as she could as fast as she could, because that was what you did when the situation was bad and the clock was moving whether you wanted it to or not. Delia, she said. The girl paused at the door. The man who was standing at the general store today. During the proceeding, dark hat, tall, dark coat. He stood against the post and looked at Crane. Delia went quiet for a moment. Her expression did something Clara couldn't entirely read. That's Jace Merrick, she said finally. Who is he? Nobody from here, Delia said. He showed up maybe 2 weeks ago. Doesn't say much. Stays at the hotel. She paused again. People are careful around him. The kind of careful where it's not exactly fear, but it rhymes with it. Crane's careful around him, Clara said. Yeah, Delia said. Crane especially. She tilted her head. Why? Because careful is interesting, Clara said. When a man like Crane is careful, it means something he can't control is nearby. Delia looked at her for a moment with those quick dark eyes. Supper's in an hour, she said again, and left. Clara lay down on this cot. Not to sleep, she wasn't going to sleep, but because her body needed horizontal for a few minutes to remember what horizontal felt like, and stared at the ceiling with its yellow-gray patches of old water stains and thought about what she knew. She knew the scheme, Callum, Crane, the false debt, the auction, the placement fee. She knew it had happened before. Delia was proof of that, and where there were two, there were more. She knew the power structure, Crane at the center, Pell and Holt as instruments, the ranch owners and merchants as beneficiaries and therefore as stakeholders in the arrangement's continuation. She knew there was a man named Jace Merrick who made Crane cautious, and that Crane being cautious about anything was unusual enough that Delia had marked it. She thought about the document she'd signed. She'd read it carefully. Crane was careful with his documents. He had to be, because that was the whole architecture of what he was doing. But careful men still made choices, and choices left traces. $63 outstanding. Itemized in the document as coach fare from Caldwell, lodging at Heron Station, lodging at Palmer Crossing, cost of advertisement. She'd paid her own coach fare from Caldwell. She had the receipt folded into the lining of her bag. She'd kept it because she kept everything that might matter. If the document claimed she'd received a coach fare, she'd actually paid herself. That was fraud. Not the genteel frontier commerce kind that Crane sold as legitimate business procedure. Actual fraud. The kind a judge in a circuit court, not Judge Pell, a different judge, a judge outside Crane's reach, would find interesting. One piece wasn't enough, but pieces accumulated. She thought about Nora, sick upstairs, debt accruing while she was too weak to work. She thought about the other women who'd come through here before. Delia had said people know, which meant there were people in this town who had watched the scheme run long enough to know exactly what it was. Witnesses existed, records existed, property transactions, debt documents, the correspondence between Callum and Crane. Those things were written down somewhere, because men who ran organized fraud needed their own paperwork to keep track of it. She thought about the land office, Crane's land office. She thought about water rights. She put her arm over her eyes and breathed. The ceiling fan that didn't exist would have been nice. The air in the room was thick and hot and smelled of iron and soap and old wood. Somewhere below her, she could hear the distant rhythmic sloshing of laundry tubs, the movement of the women who'd been here longer than her, doing the work that was keeping them in a debt that was designed to be permanent. She thought, I have been looked at my whole life and found wanting. I have been weighed on other people's scales and told I came up short. I have sat in rooms like this and held myself together by fingernails and survived every single one of them. She thought, these men have done this before and they've gotten away with it because the women they do it to have nowhere to go and nobody to tell. She thought, I have nowhere to go. But I'm very good at finding out where things are buried. She sat up. She reached into her bag and found her receipt from the Caldwell staging house, the one that said Clara Whitmore, passage from Caldwell, paid in full. And she smoothed it flat on her knee and looked at it. A small piece of paper, the kind of thing that gets thrown away. She folded it back up and tucked it into the pocket of her dress, where she could feel it against her leg. Outside the window, Black Hollow went about its afternoon. Boots on board walks, the distant sound of hammering. A woman's voice, high and brief, cut off by a closing door. The town that had stood up and watched her on that crate and decided not to do anything, because it had made its peace a long time ago with the price of looking the other way. Clara Whitmore sat in a room above a laundry she didn't choose, in a town that had tried to price her, and she thought about receipts and documents and water rights, and a man named Jace Merrick who made Aldous Crane's face go careful. She thought, let's see what you're made of, Black Hollow. She stood up and went to wash her face before supper. The first week at Bess's laundry taught Clara 3 things. The first was that steam and lye soap got into everything, your hair, your lungs, the creases of your knuckles, and that there was no way to do the work without carrying it home on your body at the end of each day. The second was that Harlan Bess was exactly what Delia had said. Not cruel, just weak. He'd look away when Clara asked him direct questions about the accounting. He'd clear his throat and find somewhere else to be when she pressed him on how the debt payments were calculated. He wasn't mean-spirited about any of it. He just couldn't hold her gaze for more than a few seconds when the subject came up, which told her everything about his conscience and nothing useful about his spine. The third thing she learned was that Black Hollow had a memory problem, not the forgetting kind, the kind where everyone remembers everything but agrees, collectively, not to say it out loud. She learned this in pieces. A woman named Ruth, who came in every Thursday with her husband's shirts. She'd pause at the counter a half-second too long when Clara worked it, like she wanted to say something and kept deciding against it. The merchant 2 doors down, a man named Tully who sold dry goods, who would nod to Clara when she passed on the street with the careful nod of a man acknowledging something he found uncomfortable. The way conversations near her in the general store would shift slightly, not stop, but adjust, like water moving around a stone. People knew. They all knew. They'd watched and said nothing, and they were still saying nothing, and the reason wasn't indifference. The reason was that Crane had made it expensive to speak. She understood this more clearly on her 8th day when she found Nora. Delia had mentioned her, the sick girl, the third one, but Clara hadn't seen her yet. She'd assumed she was in the room at the end of the upstairs hall, the one with the door that stayed closed. On the 8th morning, before the laundry opened, she knocked. The girl who answered looked like someone who'd been wrung out. She was maybe 20, fair-haired, with the kind of thinness that comes from weeks of not eating properly. She had a cloth wrapped around her throat, and her eyes were glassy in the way of people running low-grade fevers they'd been ignoring long enough that they'd stopped noticing them. "You're the new one," Nora said. Her voice was rough and careful, like she was rationing it. "Clara," she said. "Can I come in?" Nora stepped back from the door. The room was smaller than Clara's, which she hadn't thought was possible, and smelled of camphor and stale air. There was a small table with a cup on it and a folded cloth, and a stack of papers near the window that Nora moved to cover when Clara entered, then seemed to think better of hiding and left alone. "What are those?" Clara asked. Nora looked at her for a long moment. The assessment of someone deciding whether to trust who's been burned by the calculation before. Then she said, "Letters that I wrote. To the county sheriff in Harrow, to a circuit judge." She paused. "I never sent them." "Why not?" "Because Crane checks the outgoing mail. Nora said. He has an arrangement with the postwriter. Clara absorbed that. She looked at the letters, a small stack, maybe 6 or 7, edges worn from being handled. How long have you been writing them? 4 months. You've been here longer than Delia. 11 months. Nora sat on the edge of her cot. She didn't say it like she was asking for sympathy. She said it like a number she'd had to get used to. I came the same way you did. Different man, same debt. She coughed, brief and wet, and pressed the cloth to her mouth. I found out about 3 other women who came through before me. One left, just walked out one night, made it to Harrow on foot. Crane let her go because chasing her would have drawn attention. The others, she shook her head. I don't know where the others went. Clara pulled the chair from the small table and sat across from her. What's in the letters? Everything I could document. Dates, names, the amounts Crane charges, the way the accounting works. He adds fees every month that aren't in the original document. Storage fees, he calls them. For what, I don't know. And he charges for the room and board that's supposed to be included in the settlement terms. Nora looked at the stack of papers. There's enough to be interesting. Maybe enough to be more than interesting, but without getting them out of town. I have something too, Clara said. Nora looked at her. A receipt. My coach fare from Caldwell, paid by me before I left. Crane's document says the coach fare was advanced on my behalf, but I paid it myself. That's fraud. That's not frontier commerce law or whatever arrangement he's claiming. That's a forged debt. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere down on the street, a horse snorted and a man said something short and unremarkable. One receipt, Nora said carefully. It's a start, Clara said, and yours are more. Together it's a pattern, and patterns are what courts need to look at when they're deciding whether something is a bad habit or a system. She leaned forward slightly. Is there anyone in this town who hasn't been bought? Nora thought about it, genuinely thought, which Clara appreciated more than a quick answer. Tully might be. The dry goods man. He doesn't do business with Crane directly. His supply contracts go through a merchant in Harrow. He's never been part of any of the land deals. She hesitated. There's also the Reverend, but he's mostly afraid. Afraid men can still be useful, Clara said. Afraid men sometimes do things when they feel like they're not doing it alone. She looked at the letters again. The post rider, she said. When does he come? Tuesdays, late morning. Is there only the one? There's a freight wagon comes through on Fridays. Goes to Harrow, then east to Milburn. Does Crane have an arrangement with the freight driver? Nora's expression shifted, something unlocking behind her eyes. I don't know. I never thought to check. That's what we're going to find out, Clara said. She found Tully at his store counter that same afternoon, tallying a column of figures with the focused unhappiness of a man who'd rather be somewhere else. He looked up when she came in and then did the thing people did. The slight adjustment, the recalibration. The woman from the auction. She could see it move across his face before he put his shopkeeper's expression back in place. Miss Whitmore, he said. Mr. Tully. She set a short list on the counter. A few things Bess had asked her to pick up, soap and thread. I need these. He started pulling items without being asked, which meant he'd seen the list before she'd finished setting it down. Good memory, useful quality. I have a question, she said while he worked. Not about the merchandise. He didn't stop moving, but his hand slowed slightly. The freight wagon on Fridays, she said. Whose is it? Dobbs Freighting, out of Harrow, runs the Eastern Circuit. Does Aldous Crane have any business arrangement with Dobb? Tully set a bar of soap on the counter and looked at her. He had a broad, sun-weathered face, the kind that doesn't give much away by default. Why are you asking me? Because you're the person in this town who seems to have kept some distance from his arrangements, Claire said. Which means you've been paying attention to what those arrangements are. He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she thought he was going to tell her to mind her own business, which she was prepared for. Instead, he picked up the thread spool and set it next to the soap. Dobb and Crane have no arrangement that I'm aware of, he said. Dobb's a stubborn old man who doesn't much care for Crane, actually. Had a property dispute with him 3 years ago. Lost, but not because he was wrong. He paused. That's all I know. That's enough, Clara said. She paid for the items and was almost to the door when Tully spoke again. "Miss Whitmore." She turned. He was looking at the counter, not at her. "There's 3 other women who were placed the same way you were before the 2 up at Bess's. 2 of them work at the hotel, in the kitchen. One's at the Tanner's on the north end." He still didn't look up. "In case it was relevant." Clara stood with her hand on the door. "Thank you, Mr. Tully." "I didn't say anything," he said. "I know," she said, and left. She met Jace Merrick 4 days after that, and not by accident, or rather, not entirely by accident. She'd seen him twice since the auction. Once crossing the main street in the early morning, moving with the unhurried economy of someone who doesn't waste motion. Once sitting outside the hotel in the late afternoon, reading something, or seeming to. Both times she'd noticed him, and he'd noticed her noticing him, and neither of them had done anything with it. On the 12th day of her time in Black Hollow, Clara went to the hotel. Not for him specifically. She went because 2 of the women Tully had mentioned worked in the kitchen there, and she wanted to talk to them, and she wanted to do it in a way that didn't look like she was collecting testimony. She brought a basket of fresh pressed linens as cover. Bess did the hotel's laundry, which gave her a legitimate reason to be there. She was coming back through the lobby when she nearly walked into him. He stepped back, she stepped sideways. They both avoided the collision with about an inch to spare, and for a moment they were just standing there in the dim lobby with its worn rug and its smell of old wood and tobacco, looking at each other. Up close, he was a different kind of presence than he'd been across the street. Harder to read somehow, even at a shorter distance. His face had that quality of having been through things without deciding yet what to think of them. "You were at the auction," Clara said. "I was," he said. "You didn't bid." "No," he said. "I didn't." She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them seemed in a hurry to resolve the conversation into something comfortable. "Why not?" she asked. He tilted his head slightly, like the question was worth actually thinking about. Didn't seem like the right way to help. "Was that what you were considering? Helping?" "I was considering a lot of things," he said. "I hadn't sorted them out yet." It wasn't the smoothest thing anyone had ever said to her, which she found, oddly, more reassuring than a smooth answer would have been. She shifted the empty basket to her other arm. "Jace Merrick," she said. "That's right." Something moved in his expression. Not quite surprise, but an acknowledgement. "You asked around." "You made Crane nervous," she said. "I make a point of knowing what makes Crane nervous." He looked at her for a moment, and she had the sense that he was doing the same kind of filing away that she did, sorting information into the part that was useful now and the part that might be useful later. "What do you know about him?" he asked. The him didn't need a name. "I know the scheme he runs with Callum," she said. "I know the judge is his. I know the sheriff is his. I know there are at least 5 women in this town right now working off debts they don't owe, and that there were others before them." She paused. "I know his land office paperwork doesn't match his private ledgers, because men like Crane always keep 2 sets of records, and the real ones are somewhere in that building." She watched his face. "I know you've been here 2 weeks, and that you're not here by accident." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "Not by accident." "Then what are you here for?" He glanced toward the hotel's front window, not nervously, just checking. The street outside was ordinary. "Crane's been running land fraud for about 7 years. Not just the women. That's one piece of it. He's been filing false water rights claims on land that homesteaders settled legally, squeezing them off their property when he controls their water, selling the titles to ranchers who don't ask questions." He looked back at her. "I've been tracking it for 2 of those years." "On whose behalf?" "People who lost land," he said, "and a federal land office out of Millburn that started noticing the pattern about 8 months ago." He paused. "I'm not a lawman. I want to be clear about that." "What are you?" "Someone who collects information," he said, "and who's been waiting for the right moment to do something with it." Clara thought about Nora's letters, about the receipt in her pocket, about the 2 women in the hotel kitchen who'd told her, quietly, between one task and the next, about the fees that kept appearing on their debt totals, the charges for things that weren't in any document, the way the numbers never seemed to move in the right direction, no matter how hard they worked. "How much do you have?" she asked. Enough to be interesting, he said. Not enough to be certain. She almost smiled at that. Someone said something similar to me recently, she said, about a different piece of the same thing. She looked at him steadily. I have a receipt that proves my debt is fraudulent. I have a woman with 4 months of documented accounting irregularities. I have 2 more women in this building who've been keeping track of what's been done to them. And I know the freight driver on Fridays has no arrangement with Crane. She let that sit for a second. What do you have? He studied her face. She got the feeling he was a man who made decisions slowly and stuck to them once made, which was either a virtue or a problem depending on the situation, and right now she thought it was probably both. Property records going back 6 years, he said. Copies. Testimony from 4 ranchers who were pushed off their land, and a contact at the federal land office in Milburn who's been waiting for documentation that ties Crane's private ledgers to the false claims. He paused. Which means I need those ledgers. They're in the land office, Clara said. I know where they are, he said. Getting to them is the problem. Crane keeps that building locked, and the only time it's reliably open is during business hours when he or one of his men is there. Clara thought about Crane, about the document he'd produced so quickly at the auction, about the way he'd tucked it back into his coat with the ease of a man who did this often, about the land office with its yellow-lit window visible from her room above the laundry on the long evenings. He's careful, she said. He is, Jace agreed. But he doesn't think the women in this town are watching him, she said. He never has. That's the thing about men like that. They know to watch the other men. They don't think about who else is looking. Jace was quiet for a moment. Something shifted in the way he was holding himself. Not relaxed exactly, but recalibrated. Like a man who'd been working a problem alone for a long time and had just found out the problem was slightly different than he'd thought. Maybe smaller. Maybe more solvable. Friday, Clara said. The freight wagon. Friday, he said. She picked up her basket and walked back through the lobby and out into the heat of the street. She didn't look back, but she could feel him watching her go with the same quality of attention he'd given Crane at the auction. Not possessive, not predatory. The kind of attention that means someone is deciding whether to revise their assessment of a situation. She hoped he was revising it. She thought about Nora upstairs with her unsent letters, about Delia working the irons with her quick dark eyes, about 5 women in this town running a debt that was built to be permanent, about Crane's land office and its locked door and its 2 sets of records. She thought about Friday. The street was hot and white under the afternoon sun, and Black Hollow went about its business around her. The ordinary commerce of a town that had learned to live on top of something rotten and call it solid ground. A dog crossed the street. A wagon rolled in from the East End. 2 men outside the saloon talked about cattle prices. Clara walked back to the laundry with the empty basket on her arm and the receipt folded in her pocket, and the particular focused feeling of someone who has just identified the seam in a wall that looks solid, the place where, if you push it exactly the right spot, the whole thing shifts. She didn't have enough yet. She knew that. But she was building, and she was not going to stop. The freight wagon left Black Hollow every Friday at 7:30 in the morning, before the heat got serious and before most of the town had finished its first cup of coffee. Clara had spent the 3 days between her conversation with Jace and that Friday doing 2 things simultaneously, working the laundry without missing a single hour, because she couldn't afford to give Crane or Bess any reason to watch her more carefully, and building the packet that was going to Milburn on Dobbs' wagon. Nora's letters. Clara's receipt. A summary, written in Clara's careful hand, of what the 2 hotel kitchen women, May and Susanna, had told her about their own debt accounting, with dates and figures as precise as they could remember. A separate document listing the names of all 5 women currently placed in Black Hollow under Crane's settlement procedure, with the original debt amounts and the current balances as of last month, which showed that after months of labor, the totals had barely moved, and in 2 cases had actually grown. Delia had helped with that one, working from memory in the hour after the laundry closed, her voice flat and precise as she recited numbers she'd clearly been keeping track of in her head for a long time because she had nowhere else to put them. It wasn't everything. Clara knew it wasn't everything, but it was a pattern, documented, signed, and dated, and it was addressed to the federal land office in Milburn, with Jace's contact name on the envelope, and it was going out on Friday, regardless of whether it was perfect. She gave the packet to Jace on Thursday evening, passing it to him outside the hotel like she was handing him a piece of laundry, because that was what it looked like. She'd wrapped it inside a folded shirt, and he took it without comment, and she walked back to the laundry without looking over her shoulder. Friday morning, she was at the washtubs by 6. When she heard the freight wagon rolling out at 7:30, she kept working and didn't watch it go. She thought, it's done. Whatever happens next, that part is done. What happened next arrived sooner than she'd expected. On Saturday afternoon, Sheriff Holt came to the laundry. She'd seen Holt before, around the street, once at the general store, but they hadn't spoken. He was a tall man going soft in the middle, with a mustache that had been his best feature 20 years ago and now just looked like something he'd kept out of habit. He had the eyes of someone who'd made too many small compromises over too long a period and had stopped keeping track of where the line used to be. He came through the laundry's front door while Clara was working the pressing irons, and Delia was sorting a pile of shirts. He didn't take his hat off. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Sheriff," she said. She set the iron down but kept her hand near it. "Mr. Crane would like a word with you." "Mr. Crane knows where I work," she said. "He can come here." Holt looked at her with the particular patience of a man who's used to people eventually doing what he says. He'd prefer his office. "I'm sure he would," Clara said. "I'm in the middle of work. Tell him I'm available Monday morning, before the laundry opens." Delia had gone very still over the shirts, not making noise, not drawing attention to herself. Holt shifted his weight. "Miss Whitmore, I'd encourage you not to make this difficult." "I'm not making anything difficult," Clara said. "I'm working, which is what my settlement agreement requires me to be doing, so you'll understand that leaving in the middle of a workday would put me in breach of the same document Mr. Crane is very fond of." She picked the iron back up. "Monday morning." Holt stood there for a moment with his hat in his hands. When had he taken it off? Turning it the same way Bess turned his, and Clara thought, they all do that. These men who know something is wrong but won't say so. They hold their hats and turn them. He left. Delia let out a long breath. "What did you send?" she said. "Enough," Clara said. "He knows something went out." "He suspects," Clara said. "Suspecting and knowing aren't the same thing, and right now suspecting is all he has." She pressed the iron down on a collar with more force than was strictly necessary. If he knew, Holt wouldn't have asked nicely. That was true, but it didn't make her feel much better. Crane was careful, and careful men moved quickly when they thought they'd been outmaneuvered. She had 2 days before Monday morning, and she needed to use them. She found Jace that evening behind the livery, which was where he'd told her to come if something moved faster than expected. He was there, leaning against the back fence with his arms folded, and the look on his face when she came around the corner told her he'd already heard. "Holt came to see you," he said. "This afternoon. Crane wants a meeting Monday." That means something got back to him. He pushed off the fence. Either someone saw the packet go out or Dobb talked, which I don't think, but I can't rule it out. Or Crane just knows I've been asking questions, Clara said. Tully, the women at the hotel. Someone might have mentioned it, not maliciously, just in passing. She paused. "How long before we hear back from Milburn?" "Under normal circumstances, 2 weeks, maybe 3. He looked at her. "But I sent a second message 2 days ago through a different route. A writer I trust." He said, "Trust the way people do when they mean it carefully. Not blind faith, but something more specific. Earned. If the federal office takes it seriously, they could move faster. And if they don't take it seriously fast enough?" He didn't answer immediately, and she appreciated that about him. He didn't fill silences with reassurance when he didn't have any to give. "Then we need to be further along before Crane decides to stop asking nicely," he said. Clara had been thinking about the land office for 3 days. She'd been walking past it, timing things. When Crane arrived, when he left, when the lights went off. She talked to May at the hotel about the one time she'd been sent to the land office to deliver a message for the hotel owner 2 years ago and what she'd seen inside. And she'd had one conversation with the Reverend, a thin, nervous man named Aldgate, who ran the small church on the east side of town and who Nora had said was afraid but not entirely lost, who had told her, in the course of what he'd thought was a general conversation about the town's history, that Crane had originally set up his land office in a building that used to be a records hall for the county. and that there was a back storage room that had once been accessible from the alley before Crane had the door sealed. Sealed, but not removed. "The land office," she said. Jace looked at her. "There's a sealed door in the alley on the east side," she said. "Sealed from the outside about 5 years ago, according to the Reverend. Which means from the inside it's still a door, just blocked." "Blocked with what?" "I don't know," she said. "Could be furniture. Could be nothing more than a bar and a habit." She held his gaze. "The front window faces the main street, but the back of the building faces an alley that runs between the land office and the Tanners. If someone were in that alley on a night when Crane wasn't in the building, that someone would need to know how to open a sealed door quietly," Jace said, "and would need to know which records to look for and how to copy them fast." She paused. "I know what we need. I've read his document format. I know his handwriting. I know his abbreviations. I know what a fraudulent land claim looks like in his filing system because I've seen 3 of them in the documents he used to process my debt." He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that's doing a lot of quiet work. "You're describing breaking into Crane's land office," he said. "I'm describing recovering evidence of ongoing fraud from a building in a town where the only judge is on the fraudster's payroll," she said. "What I'm describing depends on who's describing it." He didn't smile exactly, but something around his eyes did. "Wednesday night," he said. "Crane plays cards at the saloon every Wednesday from 9 until past midnight. I've watched it 4 weeks running. He takes one of his men with him, the other one, Walsh. He patrols the street until about 10, then he goes home." He looked at her. "That gives us a window." "Wednesday," she said. Sunday passed with the taut, stretched feeling of waiting. Monday morning, Clara went to Crane's office because not going would have told him something going would not. His office was the front room of the land office. A large desk, a map of the county pinned to the wall with property lines marked in different colors, filing cabinets along one wall that were locked, shelves of bound ledgers behind him. He was sitting at the desk when she came in, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who has recalculated something and is deciding whether to show the result. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Sit down." She sat. "I'll get to the point," he said. "It's come to my attention that you've been asking questions about my business arrangements, about the settlement procedures in this county, about a number of things that are frankly none of your concern." He leaned back. "I understand you're unhappy about your situation. That's natural. But I want to make something clear. The arrangement you signed is legally binding, and anything you think you might accomplish by talking to people in this town, or—" He paused just a fraction of a second, which was all the pause a careful man would allow himself. "Communicating with people outside it is not going to change that." Clara sat with her hands in her lap and looked at him. "I ask questions because I'm trying to understand the terms of my debt," she said. "That's a reasonable thing for a person to do." "Your debt is $63, Crane said. "The terms are in the document you signed." "The document that lists a coach fare I paid myself," Clara said. The room went quiet in the way rooms do when someone has said the thing that wasn't supposed to be said yet. Crane's expression didn't crack. He was too good for that. But it reset the way a clock face resets when the mechanism behind it has been touched. "I don't know what you think you have," he said, "but I'd encourage you to think carefully about the position you're putting yourself in." "I think about my position constantly," Clara said. "It's one of the main things I do." She stood up. "I'll be back at work now." She walked to the door. "Miss Whitmore." His voice had changed. Not louder, not rougher, but something in the smoothness was gone, like a board that's warped slightly in the heat. "Don't make me do something neither of us wants." She turned at the door. She looked at him, at the pale eyes and the silver vest chain and the locked filing cabinets full of other people's land and other people's labor. "Mr. Crane," she said, "you have been doing things neither of the other parties wanted for a long time. I don't think my preferences have ever been part of your calculation." She left. Wednesday night came down cold and clear, which was unusual for the season, and which Clara decided not to read as anything except weather. She left the laundry at 9:30, after the street had gone quiet. She went the long way, south end, behind the Tanners, through the connecting alley. And Jace was already there when she arrived, crouched low near the sealed door with something in his hands that she couldn't make out in the dark. "Anyone on the street?" she said, barely above a whisper. "Clear," he said. "Walsh went home 20 minutes ago." The door was wood, old, the frame slightly swollen with age and weather. The seal was external. 2 iron brackets and a crossbar bolted from the outside, which from the inside would simply be a door with no visible hardware. Jace worked the brackets with a short pry tool, moving slowly to keep the noise down. Clara watched the mouth of the alley. The town breathed around them. A distant voice from the saloon, a horse moving in the livery, the creak and settle of buildings at night. Normal sounds. She listened beneath them for anything that wasn't normal and heard nothing. The crossbar came free. Jace eased the door open 6 inches, then stopped, listening. Then wider. Inside was dark and smelled of paper and dust and the particular dry smell of old wood that never gets enough air. Jace had a small lantern, shielded, minimal light, and he lit it once they were inside and the door was pulled mostly closed behind them. The back room was a storage space, floor to ceiling with shelving on 3 walls. Filing boxes, bound ledgers going back years, rolled survey maps in standing tubes. Crane kept things organized. She'd expected that. The question was which system he used for the record she needed. "Land claims are in the blue boxes," Jace said quietly. He'd been here before, she realized. Not inside, but he'd thought about this room. Water rights in the green ones. The private ledgers. The real accounting. He keeps those separate from the official files. "Top shelf," Claire said. She was looking at the shelving with the focused attention she brought to documents, the way you read a room when you know what you're looking for. Men who keep 2 sets of records always put the real ones somewhere less accessible. Not hidden, just inconvenient enough that nobody stumbles on them. She moved to the far wall where the top shelf sat above her head height and looked at the boxes there. 4 of them, unmarked. She pulled down the first one. Inside, correspondence. Letters between Crane and a man named Deverell in the capital, going back 4 years. She scanned the first 2 pages and felt something shift in her chest. Not excitement, something colder than that. The specific feeling of finding what you were looking for and having it be worse than you expected. Deverell was a land commissioner. She looked at Jace. He was going through the blue boxes along the opposite wall, pulling files, scanning them in the lantern light. "How much time do we have?" she asked. "Crane plays until midnight at least. It's 10:30. He looked up. "What did you find?" "The commissioner," she said. "Crane has a contact in the capital. Someone who's been approving the fraudulent claims from the other end." She looked back at the letters. "This isn't just Crane. This is bigger than Black Hollow." He crossed to her and looked at the papers over her shoulder. She was aware of how close he was, the smell of dust and night air, and then she was not aware of it because the documents in her hand required everything. They worked for 40 minutes. Not copying everything, there was no time for that, but identifying, selecting, taking the specific documents that showed the clearest lines. Crane's private ledger with its dual accounting, the Deverell correspondence, 6 land claim files with fraudulent survey dates, and the original debt documents for all 5 women currently placed in Black Hollow, which were in a separate folder in the blue box labeled with a year and a letter that meant nothing from the outside, but which Clara cracked in about 30 seconds. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt the weight of what she was holding, the specific papery weight of years of damage done quietly to people who didn't know it was coming. And she folded it all carefully into the document case Jace had brought, and she breathed through her nose and stayed focused. They left the same way they'd come. Jace reset the brackets and crossbar from outside. Imperfect, slightly off angle, but in the dark, it would pass. He'd check it in the morning, he said. If Crane noticed, they'd know quickly. At the mouth of the alley, they stopped. "This is enough," Clara said. She meant for Milburn. She meant for the federal contact. "It's more than enough for Milburn," Jace said. "The Deverell piece, a land commissioner in the capital. That's going to bring people here. That's not a county matter anymore." "How fast?" "Faster than 2 weeks," he said. "If I can get this out tomorrow." "Friday," she said. Daub. Friday, he agreed. They stood in the alley in the dark for a moment, two people who had just done something irreversible together, which creates a particular kind of quiet. You should know, Jay said, that when this moves, it's going to move fast and it's going to be loud. Crane will figure out something happened before the federal men get here. There's going to be a window between when he knows and when they arrive, where things could get rough. I know, Clara said. You don't have to be the one standing in front of it, he said. It wasn't a suggestion exactly, more like a thing he felt obligated to say. She looked at him in the dark. Yes, she said, I do. He seemed to think about arguing and decided against it, which she also appreciated. They went their separate ways, him back toward the hotel, her back the long way to the laundry. And Clara moved through the quiet streets of Black Hollow with the document case in her mind like a live thing, already sending its ripples forward into the days ahead. She lay down on her cot that night and didn't sleep for a long time, listening to the town settle around her, thinking about Crane's face when he'd said, "Don't make me do something neither of us wants." The way the smoothness had gone out of his voice for just that second. She thought, "You already did it, Mr. Crane. You did it the day you put me on that crate. You just don't know the cost yet." Crane discovered the break-in on Thursday morning. Clara knew because she heard him from half a block away. Not shouting, Crane didn't shout, but there was a quality to the way sound carried from the land office that morning that was different from usual. Voices clipped short. A door opened and shut twice in quick succession. Walsh moving at a pace he didn't usually move at. She kept working. She pressed shirts and folded linens and said nothing, and she felt the knowledge of what was coming settle into her body the way cold water settles. Not comfortable, but clarifying. By mid-morning, the whole street knew something had happened at the land office, the way towns know things, through the particular quality of how men stood when they talked, through the way conversations near the general store kept glancing east, through Bess coming into the laundry at 11 and clearing his throat 3 times before saying anything. "Crane's had a break-in," he said. "Is that right?" Clara said. Bess looked at her. He was a man who wasn't good at sustained dishonesty. His face did too much. "Clara." He stopped. Started again. "Whatever you've done." "I've been here since 6 this morning," she said. "Delia can tell you that. And the night before I was in my room, Nora heard me moving around until past midnight because she doesn't sleep well. None of that was technically a lie. She had been in her room until nearly 10. Nora had been awake. The details were just arranged." Bess turned his hat. "He's going to come here," he said. "Then he'll find me working," Clara said. Crane came at 2 in the afternoon, and this time he didn't send Holt first. He came himself with Walsh behind him, and he came into the laundry the way water comes under a door, without announcing itself, already there before you'd quite registered the arrival. He looked at Clara across the steam and the folding tables and the smell of hot linen, and his face had done something she hadn't seen it do before. The smoothness was still there, mostly, but underneath it something had gone tight and angular, like a structure that's lost one of its load-bearing points and is redistributing the weight. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "a word outside." "Anything you want to say to me, you can say here," Clara said. She didn't stop folding. Walsh took a step forward. Crane held up one hand, barely a gesture, just a slight lift of 2 fingers, and Walsh stopped. "Documents are missing from my office," Crane said. "Private business records." "That's a matter for the sheriff," Clara said. "The sheriff is looking into it," Crane said. "I'm here because I think you might know something about it." She set down the shirt she was holding and looked at him fully. "On what basis?" "On the basis that you've been asking questions about my business since you arrived, and that you were seen," he paused, "in the south part of town late Wednesday evening." Seen. So someone had spotted her coming back. She didn't know who, didn't know what they'd seen exactly, but she kept her face neutral and let him continue. "I go where my work takes me," she said. "Bess has deliveries on the south end." "Not at 10 at night." "I'm not confined to this building, Mr. Crane. That's not in my settlement agreement." They looked at each other across the laundry. Delia was at the far end of the room, very still over her work, not making eye contact with anyone. I want to be very direct with you, Crane said, and the smoothness was almost entirely gone now, the voice underneath it harder and flatter and less managed. I don't know exactly what you've taken or who you've talked to, but if there is any correspondence, any documents, any material from my office that has left this town, there will be consequences that go far beyond your debt. What I have built here is not something I will allow one woman to dismantle. Clara thought about the document case, about the Deverell letters, the dual ledger, the fraudulent land claim files already on Dobbs' wagon 2 days ago and rolling toward Milburn. She thought about the federal land office and Jace's contact and the word commissioner written at the top of a letter she'd held in her hands in the dark of a back room while a clock counted down. I'm a laundress working off a debt, she said. I don't know what you think I could have taken from a locked office. Crane looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the room, at Delia, at the tubs and irons and folded stacks, and something in his expression closed off, made a decision she couldn't read. You should think about whether this town is a safe place for someone in your position, he said. I think about my position all the time, she said. It came out quieter than she intended, and somehow that made it land harder. I've been thinking about it since the day I got off the coach, and you put me on a crate. Walsh shifted behind Crane. Crane said nothing. The silence stretched for 3 or 4 seconds that felt like longer. Then he left. Clara went back to folding. Her hands were steady. The rest of her was not, quite, but that was internal, and she was keeping it there. Delia looked up from the far end of the room. She didn't say anything. She just looked, and Clara looked back. And something passed between them that didn't need words. That evening, Jace found her. He came to the alley behind the laundry, 2 soft knocks on the back door, the signal they'd agreed on, and Clara slipped out into the cooling evening to find him standing with his back to the building, watching the street at the alley's far end. He knows something went out, she said. I heard about the visit. He glanced at her. Are you all right? I'm fine. She said it plainly, not bristling at the question. He threatened me without saying anything I can use against him. Told me the town wasn't safe for someone in my position. He's not wrong that it's not safe, Jace said. He's wrong that it's going to stop me. She crossed her arms against the evening chill. Where are we? I got a message back, he said. Not from Milburn. From the writer I sent before the packet. He paused, and she heard something in that pause that was different from his usual deliberateness. There are 2 federal investigators already in the region. They've been working the land fraud angle for 3 months. Our packet, the documentation, it landed on top of something they were already building. He looked at her. They're coming to Black Hollow. Estimated 4 days. 4 days. Clara let that sit for a second. 4 days was both faster than she'd dared to expect and still long enough for a lot of things to go wrong. Does Crane have any way of knowing that? She asked. Not from my end. But Crane's not stupid. He knows something left town. He knows it was substantial enough to make him move quickly, and he'll be calculating how long he has. Jace's jaw tightened slightly. The problem is Holt. If Crane decides the best move is to make the documentation disappear before anyone federal arrives. He can't make it disappear, Clara said. It's already in Milburn. He doesn't know that. He doesn't know how far it's gone or who has it. That's actually the most dangerous part. A man who knows he's been hit but doesn't know from where yet. He'll start applying pressure to everything he can reach. He looked at her directly. You specifically. I know. Clara. He said her name without the formality they'd mostly kept between them, and she noticed. I'm serious about this part. Crane pressuring you is one thing. Walsh and the men Crane can call from the ranches east of town. That's something else. How many men? 4 or 5 he can get here in a day. Hard men. Not outlaws, but not particular about what they're paid to do. He paused. I've been talking to some people too. The ranchers who lost land, 2 of them are within half a day's ride. They're willing to come if asked. And there are men in this town who are not happy with how things have been run, who've been waiting for someone to go first. Tully, she said. Tully. A couple others. The Reverend, maybe, if it gets public enough that he can't look the other way. He paused. It's not a force. It's not organized. But it's bodies and voices, which matters when a situation needs to be witnessed. Clara thought about the next 4 days. She thought about Crane recalculating, about Walsh patrolling, about the women in this town who were still working off false debts and who had more to lose than she did if this fell apart before the federal men arrived. "We can't just wait," she said. "No," he agreed. "If Crane decides to move, to arrest me, or to put pressure on Delia and the others to recant anything they've said, we need something that stops that before it happens." She was working through it as she spoke, the way she worked through problems, out loud and fast, and not waiting to have it fully formed. A public confrontation, something in front of the town where Crane has to respond without the privacy he's used to. Jace looked at her. "He's going to say I stole from him," she said. "He's going to try to use that to undermine everything, so we get ahead of it. We call him out first, publicly, specifically, before he can frame it his way." She looked back at him. "Not a fight, a reckoning. In front of everyone who's been pretending not to know." He was quiet for a moment. "That's risky." "Everything we've done has been risky," she said. "This is more directly risky," he said. "For you specifically." "I know," she said. "I'm the one who got auctioned in the street. If anyone stands up and names what Crane has been doing, it should be me. That part isn't negotiable." He looked at the end of the alley, then back at her. Something in his expression was doing that recalibration thing she'd seen before, the quiet revision of how he understood a situation. "Saturday," he said. "Market day. Most of the town is out." "Saturday," she said. Chiti. The next 2 days were the strangest of Clara's time in Black Hollow. Crane was visible everywhere, in the way Holt's deputies circled the main street more often, in the way Walsh watched the laundry from across the road with the unconvincing casualness of a man who'd been told to watch it, in the way 2 of the ranch hands from the East properties drifted into town Thursday evening and tied their horses outside the saloon and didn't seem to have any particular business being there. Clara worked. She worked with the focused calm of someone who needs the rhythm of physical labor to keep the thinking part of her brain from running too fast. She talked to Delia, who understood what was coming, and squared her shoulders and said, "I'll be there." She talked to Nora, who was stronger. The fever had broken 3 days prior, the rest and the change in air had helped, and who said the same thing. She found May and Susanna at the hotel laundry pickup on Friday morning and told them, in plain terms, what Saturday would look like and what she needed from them, which was simply to be present and not to disappear if things got loud. She went to see Tully Friday afternoon. He was behind his counter as always, but he was watching the street when she came in. Had been watching it, she thought, for a while. He looked at her with the expression of a man who's been waiting for something and isn't sure if he's relieved or frightened that it's arrived. "Saturday," she said before he could speak. "Market day. I'm going to say publicly what Crane has been doing. I need you to not leave when it starts." Tully set both hands flat on the counter. "Clara," he said. It was the first time he'd used her name. "Crane has 3 men watching this block. If you do this and it goes wrong—" "I know what happens if it goes wrong," she said. "I have a business. I have—" He stopped, pressed his lips together. "I'm not a brave man." "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to be brave. I'm asking you to stay. That's different." She leaned slightly toward him. "You've known what's been happening here for a long time, Mr. Tully. I think it's been sitting on you. I think that's why you told me about the women at the hotel, about Dobb. You didn't have to tell me any of that." He looked at the counter. "Saturday," she said again. "Just stay." He didn't answer, but when she left, she heard him exhale behind her. The long, complicated exhale of a man making a decision he'd been deferring for years. Saturday morning came in bright and dry, the kind of day Black Hollow could do well when the dust wasn't up. Clear sky, clean light, a faint breeze off the plain to the west. The market set up along the main street the way it did every week. Produce wagons, a woman selling preserves from a table, a leather worker with his goods hung on a line, the general noise and movement of a town doing ordinary commerce. Clara waited until the street was full. She walked to the center of the main street, not the boardwalk, not a doorway, the middle of the street, and she stood there until a few people noticed, and then a few more, And then the noticing spread the way it does in a crowd, quiet and rapid, one person touching the elbow of the next. Crane was outside the land office. She saw him see her, and she saw the calculation run across his face. What she was doing, what it would cost to stop her visibly versus what it would cost to let her speak. She saw him decide to let her speak, because stopping her in front of this many people would be its own kind of problem. "I have something to say," Clara said. She didn't shout. She spoke the way you speak when you need a room to hear you, from the chest, carried, clear. To this town, to the people who live here and the people who've been watching what goes on here. The street had gone quiet. Not entirely, the edges still moved, but the center of it, the people nearest her, had stopped. "My name is Clara Whitmore," she said. 3 weeks ago, I was stood on a crate in front of this store and auctioned to pay a debt that wasn't mine. Most of you watched." She paused. "I don't say that to shame you. I say it because I need you to understand that what was done to me wasn't unusual here. It's been done before. It's being done right now to 4 other women in this town. And the man who runs it has been doing it long enough that everyone has decided it's just the way things are." She saw Crane starting toward her, Walsh beside him. She also saw from the corner of her eye Jace stepping off the hotel's front porch into the street, positioning himself 30 feet to Crane's left, arms loose, watching. She kept talking. "Aldous Crane controls the land office, the water rights, the judge, and the sheriff of this county," she said. "He has been filing fraudulent land claims for 7 years and forcing homesteaders off property they legally settled. He has been running a scheme with a man named Roy Callum to manufacture false debts and auction women who come here looking for honest work and honest lives." She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out the receipt, her receipt, the one she'd carried since Caldwell. "I have proof that my debt is a forgery. I have documented evidence of the accounting fraud used to keep women working without ever reducing what they owe. And there are federal investigators who have been building a case against Crane's land fraud for months, who are on their way to Black Hollow right now." Crane had stopped moving. He was 10 feet from her, and his face, she watched it, she'd been watching it since she started talking, had gone through 3 different calculations in 30 seconds and landed on something cold and contained. "This woman," he said, loudly and carefully, "broke into a private office and stole business documents. She is in breach of her settlement agreement and is subject to—" "I want to ask the people of this town something," Clara said, not over him, but after him, in the brief space before he could continue. She turned slightly, looking at the faces around her. Ruth in her calico, Tully in his doorway, the Reverend at the edge of the crowd, his hat in his hands. "How many of you have sold land in the last 7 years and wondered afterward why the water rights didn't transfer the way you expected? How many of you have had property disputes that somehow always ended in Crane's favor at Pell's Court? How many of you have watched women come into this town and disappear into debt they can never pay and told yourself it was their problem?" Nobody spoke, but nobody left either. And then, from the edge of the crowd, a man's voice, one of the ranchers Jace had contacted, she recognized the face from the description, said, "I lost 40 acres on the East Creek in 1881. Crane said the title was disputed. It wasn't." Then another voice. A woman this time, from the hotel kitchen, May. "I've been here 14 months. My debt was $38. They say I still owe 31. Walsh took a step toward Clara. Jace moved, not fast, just definitively into Walsh's line of movement, and Walsh stopped. They stood 3 feet apart, and something passed between them that was entirely physical, the language of 2 men measuring each other. And then Walsh took a step back. Crane looked at Jace. That same look from the auction, the cautious look, the recalibrating look. But this time there was something else behind it. The look of a man who has just understood that the thing he thought was a single problem has turned out to be a convergence of problems, arriving from all sides at once, and that his window for managing it quietly has already closed. "This is not over," Crane said. He said it to the street as much as to Clara. It was the statement of a man who still believed he could regroup, could use Holt, could find the lever that would make this manageable again. "No," Clara said. "It's not." She looked at him steadily. But it started, and that's enough. He turned and walked back to the land office, and the door shut behind him, and for a moment the main street of Black Hollow was just a street full of people standing in the morning light, looking at each other and at the woman standing in the middle of the road with a receipt in her hand and her feet planted solid in the dust. Tully was still in his doorway. He caught her eye and gave her the slow, careful nod of a man who had stayed. Clara exhaled. Her legs were shaking. She hadn't known that until just now, the way the body saves certain information for after. She stood still and let them shake and didn't let it show in her face because the street was still watching and she wasn't done yet. Not by a long way. But the silence that Crane had kept over this town for 7 years, the collective agreed-upon silence of people who'd decided the cost of speaking was too high, had developed a crack. Cracks, she knew, had a way of spreading. The federal investigators arrived on Tuesday. Not the dramatic arrival Clara had half imagined in her more tired moments. No thunder, no cavalry column raising dust on the horizon. Just 2 men on horses, dusty from the road, riding into Black Hollow on an ordinary Tuesday morning when the sky was white with heat and the street smelled of horse and dry wood the same as any other day. They tied up outside the hotel, went inside, and asked for a room each. By noon, everyone in town knew who they were. Their names were Garrett and Foss. Garrett was older, compact, with the careful eyes of a man who'd spent his career reading documents and the people who'd made them. Foss was younger, quieter, the kind of quiet that suggested he was doing more work than he appeared to be. They didn't announce themselves officially on that first day. They ate lunch at the hotel, walked the main street once at a measured pace, and retired early. Clara watched them from the laundry window and felt something in her chest that wasn't quite relief. Relief was too simple for what this was. It was more like the feeling of having been holding a beam in place for a long time, and sensing, for the first time, other hands taking some of the weight. Jace met with them that evening. She wasn't there for it. They'd agreed his federal contact was his thread to pull, and she had her own work to do. But he came to the back door of the laundry afterward and told her how it went. "They have more than we sent them," he said. "Our packet confirmed what they already had from 2 other counties. Crane's operation in Black Hollow is the most documented piece, but it's part of something that runs 3 counties over." He paused. "Deverell, the commissioner in the capital, he's already been suspended pending investigation. Somebody moved fast once our letters arrived." Clara absorbed that. Deverell suspended. She thought about those letters in the back room of the land office, the careful correspondence between a corrupt county operator and a man in the capital who'd been smoothing the path for him, and felt the particular cold satisfaction of knowing a piece she'd handled in the dark was now doing work in the light somewhere she'd never see. "What about Crane?" she asked. "Garrett wants to move on him Thursday morning," Jace said. "Give them 2 days to finish their documentation. They want to do it cleanly, arrest with a full federal warrant, not something Crane's lawyers can pull apart on jurisdictional grounds." "Holt?" Holt's been told, quietly, that cooperation is his best option at this point. Garrett said he turned pale and sat down without being asked. Jace almost smiled. Apparently Holt had been meaning to get out of Crane's arrangement for a while and just couldn't find the moment. "Men like Holt always mean to do the right thing eventually," Clara said. "The trick is making eventually arrive." She said it without much bitterness, which surprised her. 3 weeks ago, even 1 week ago, she'd have said it with more heat. But something had shifted in her since Saturday, since standing in the street and watching Crane's face go through its 3 calculations and land on cold containment. She didn't feel warm toward Holt, but she also didn't feel the need to drag him through what he deserved. He was a small piece of a larger structure, and the structure was coming down, and that was what mattered. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," Jace confirmed. But Wednesday passed in a state of suppressed tension that the whole town seemed to feel without knowing exactly why. Crane was visible. He appeared at the land office in the morning. He walked the main street at his usual time. He went to the saloon at his usual hour. But there was something mechanical about the routine now, like a man performing normalcy for an audience he knew was watching but couldn't quite locate. Walsh stayed close to him. The 2 ranch hands who'd drifted in from the east properties were still around, though they'd been quieter since Saturday. Clara worked. She helped Nora with her letters. The official ones now, the ones Garrett's office would want, the documented testimony of 11 months under Crane's arrangement, and sat with her for an hour in the late afternoon when the work was done and Nora was tired in the specific way of someone who has been holding something tightly for a very long time and has just been told she can start to let go. "What are you going to do?" Nora asked. "After." Clara had been asked this twice already, by Delia, who'd asked it matter-of-factly while folding sheets, and by May at the hotel, who'd asked it with the anxious edge of someone who needed to know there was an after worth planning for. She'd given practical answers both times. Wait for the debt to be voided, figure out from there. True enough, just not complete. "I don't know yet," she told Nora, which was more honest. "Are you going to leave?" Clara looked at the window. The strip of sky above the alley had gone gold with late afternoon, the particular dusty gold of this part of the country that she'd come to recognize over 3 weeks, that she'd stopped seeing as desolate and started seeing as simply itself. "I thought I would," she said. "When I first got here, all I thought about was getting out." She paused. "But this town is going to need—" She stopped again. Not because she didn't know what she meant, but because saying it out loud was a different thing from thinking it. There are going to be land records to sort through, people who lost property to figure out if they can get it back, women who need someone to help them understand what their rights actually are now that Crane's structure is gone. She looked at Nora. "I'm good at documents. I'm good at paperwork. I'm not a lawyer, but I can read a contract as well as most lawyers I've encountered, which isn't a high bar." Nora watched her with those glassy, tired eyes that had gotten a little less glassy over the past week. "That's not really an answer to whether you're leaving." "No," Clara said. "It's not." Thursday morning, Garrett and Foss arrested Aldous Crane at the land office at 8 o'clock. Clara wasn't on the street for it. She'd thought about being there, had almost gone, had stood at the laundry's front window with her hand on the doorframe, and then decided not to. Not because she was afraid and not because she didn't feel she'd earned the right to watch, but because she realized she didn't need it. She'd already had her moment on Saturday, standing in the dust with her receipt in her hand and the town's silence cracking around her. She didn't need to watch Crane be walked out of his office in handcuffs to know it was over. She heard it from Delia, who'd been out front and described it in the flat, precise tone she used for things that mattered. Crane had been at his desk, Garrett had presented the warrant, Walsh had stepped forward and then stepped back when Foss moved, and Crane had stood up and put on his coat and walked out without making a scene. The performance of dignity from a man who'd run out of other options. Judge Pell had resigned by noon citing health reasons, which made Tully laugh so hard when he heard it that he had to sit down. Holt submitted his cooperation formally to Garrett's office and was allowed to remain in his position provisionally, pending review, which meant he'd spend the next year proving himself to people he'd previously ignored, which Clara thought was a reasonable arrangement. Roy Callum was arrested at his ranch east of town on Friday by a deputy from Harrow, which was as much as Clara had allowed herself to think about Roy Callum. He was a piece of the machine, significant enough to matter legally and small enough that she found, when his name came up, that she had almost nothing left for him. Not even anger, just the flat acknowledgement of what he was. The debt documents, all of them, for all 5 women, were voided by federal order within the week. Garrett handed Clara a copy of the order with the particular manner of a man who does important paperwork so routinely that he'd stopped registering its weight. She took it and read it standing in the hotel lobby, and then folded it carefully and put it in her pocket next to the space where the receipt used to be, which she'd finally taken out and smoothed flat and put in a proper envelope, because it had done its work and deserved to be kept properly. The weeks after that were not uncomplicated, which Clara had expected. The land fraud cases were tangled and slow. Property that had been taken and resold was not simply returned. There were chains of title, secondary buyers who'd acted in good faith, competing claims that would take circuit court sessions to sort out. Garrett told Clara, on his last day in Black Hollow, before riding back to Milburn, that some of those cases would take 2 years to fully resolve. 2 years, she said. At minimum, he said. He looked at her steadily. You understand the law better than most people I meet who aren't lawyers. Have you considered? I'm a laundress, she said. You were a laundress to pay off a debt that no longer exists, he said. What you are is a different question. She thought about that for a long time after he left. The town reorganized itself in the lurching, imperfect way that towns do when the power that has held them in a particular shape is removed. There were arguments. There were people who'd benefited from Crane's arrangement in small ways. Merchants who'd gotten favorable terms, ranchers who'd looked the other way when neighboring property changed hands, who now had to figure out what their cooperation had cost and what, if anything, was required of them going forward. These conversations were not clean. Some of them got loud. Clara was present for more of them than she'd expected to be. It started practically. She was good at documents, and people knew it, and there was an enormous amount of paperwork to be sorted as Crane's records were unsealed and reviewed. Garrett's office needed people who could read the filing system, cross-reference dates, flag inconsistencies. Clara could do it faster and more accurately than anyone else available, so she did it. Then Tully came to her with a contract dispute, not Crane-related, an ordinary commercial disagreement with a supplier, and asked her to look it over. She found 3 clauses that would have cost him money over 5 years and told him how to renegotiate them. He paid her for the afternoon's work without being asked, which she hadn't expected, and which she took without false modesty because she'd earned it. Then one of the displaced ranchers, a man named Okereke, who'd lost 40 acres on the East Creek, came to her with the deed documents from 1881, and she spent 2 evenings going through the chain of title and found the specific point where Crane had inserted a fraudulent survey amendment and wrote it up in a form that Okereke could take to the circuit court. And he did. And 3 months later, he got 22 of his 40 acres back. Not all of it. The rest was genuinely complicated and probably lost. But 22 acres was 22 acres, and Okereke stood on her doorstep and shook her hand and didn't say anything for a moment because sometimes there isn't anything that fits. She wasn't saving anyone. She was clear about that with herself because the impulse to frame it that way was there, and she didn't trust it. She was doing work she was good at, work that needed doing, in a place that needed it done. The satisfaction of it was real, and it was earned, and it was also incomplete. Because justice done slowly and partially is still incomplete justice, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise just because the outcome was better than nothing. Nora left Black Hollow in the 2nd month. She went back to Ohio with avoided debt, and Delia's address written in her pocket, and the kind of thinness that takes a winter to fill back out. She hugged Clara at the coach and said, "I don't know how to thank you." And Clara said, "Don't. I needed your letters as much as you needed mine to be sent." Which was true, and which Nora seemed to understand. Delia stayed. She started working for Bess on a wage, an actual wage, negotiated by Clara with Bess over a conversation that lasted 90 minutes and included a moment where Bess nearly cried, which neither of them acknowledged. Delia was sharp and practical and had opinions about everything, which made her hard to work with and valuable to have around. And Clara told her both of those things plainly, which Delia received with the flat nod of a woman who doesn't need to be flattered, but will accept accurate assessment. The thing with Jace was slower than everything else, and less tidy, and she thought those were probably the right qualities for it. He'd stayed in Black Hollow longer than he'd intended. She knew this without him saying it, the same way she knew most things about him by now. Through observation, through the spaces around what he said. He'd been a man in motion for a long time. The investigation, the tracking, the 2 years of building a case while moving through towns that weren't his. Staying in one place seemed to require adjustment, the way eyes require adjustment when you come in from bright light into a dim room. He helped with the land case work in the early weeks. He had records and testimony that overlapped with what Garrett's office needed, and he spent long afternoons at the table in what had been the land office and was now temporarily a records review room, going through documents with Clara, cross-referencing dates and survey numbers. They argued twice. Once about the order in which to present evidence for Okereke's claim, she thought chronologically, he thought by impact, and they went back and forth for 20 minutes before arriving at something that was neither of their original positions but was better than both. The second time was about something smaller, an interpretation of a contract clause, and it got sharper than it needed to before they both recognized they were tired and stopped. After the second argument, sitting on opposite sides of the table with the documents between them and the late afternoon light coming through the land office window, Jay said, You don't back down. Neither do you, she said. I know. He looked at the table. I'm not complaining about it. Good, she said, because I'm not planning to change it. He looked up at her, and for a moment they were just looking at each other the way they had in the hotel lobby that first time, taking measure, recalibrating, the ongoing work of understanding a person you've decided to keep knowing. I'm thinking about staying, he said, in Black Hollow, for a while. For a while, she said. I don't know how long. I don't know how long I'm staying either, she said. There's a lot of work to finish. Yeah, he said, there is. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't the kind of conversation that gets remembered as the moment things changed, because things had been changing gradually, the way land changes. Not in a single event, but in the slow accumulation of weather and time. What it was honest. Two people sitting across a table in a former corrupt official's office, telling each other what was true, which was that they didn't know how things would go, and they were staying anyway. She'd learned that was enough. Maybe it was the only thing that ever actually held. Months later, deep enough into autumn that the mornings had gone cold and the dust had a different quality, drier and sharper, Clara sat on the bench outside Tully's store in the late afternoon and watched Black Hollow move around her. It was not a transformed town. She wanted to be clear about that, even in her own head, because the story you tell yourself about what you've done can get inflated if you're not careful, and she'd been careful about this her whole life. The buildings were the same. The street was the same dusty width. Some of the same people who'd stood at the auction and watched her on that crate still walked past her on this bench, and not all of them met her eyes, and some of the ones who did were working through something complicated that hadn't resolved yet. But the land office had a new acting registrar, appointed by the circuit court, who kept one set of books. Judge Pell's seat was being filled by a circuit judge out of Harrow who came through monthly and was inconveniently honest. Holt was still sheriff, still adjusting, still occasionally performing that hat-turning gesture she'd come to associate with men whose conscience was larger than their courage, but not absent. Okereki's fence posts were back in the ground on 22 acres of East Creek land. May and Susanna were drawing wages at the hotel. Delia had started teaching herself to read contracts because she'd watched Clara do it enough times that she'd decided she wanted to do it too. None of that was a triumph. It was just the ordinary texture of things getting better in the incomplete, grinding way that things actually get better, which requires people to keep showing up after the dramatic part is over. That was the part nobody told you about. Not the confrontation in the street, not the arrest, not the voided debt. The part after. The slow part. The part where you wake up on an ordinary Tuesday and go back to the work because the work doesn't end. She heard boots on the boardwalk and looked up. Jace came out of Tully's with 2 cups of coffee, the kind Tully sold from the back of his store, thick and oversugared and better than anything in town, and sat down on the bench beside her. He handed her a cup without asking if she wanted one, which was a small thing that she'd noticed in herself noticing. They sat for a while in the cooling afternoon watching the street. Okereki's son came in today, she said. He wants to know if there's a case for the second 20 acres. Is there? Maybe. I need to look at the original survey from 1879. She drank the coffee. It's going to be complicated. Most things are, he said. A wagon rolled by, a family she recognized. Newcomers, arrived last month from the east, husband and wife and 3 kids under 8, settled on land that had cleared title. The wife caught Clara's eye as the wagon passed and gave a nod that was brief and real. Clara nodded back. She thought about the woman who'd arrived on the noon coach 11 weeks ago with 1 bag and a wool dress too heavy for the heat, who'd stood on a crate in front of this street and held herself straight while strangers put a price on her because they'd decided that was the kind of thing that could be done. She thought about that woman and felt for her. Genuinely. The way you feel for someone who was you but is now also slightly separate from you, far enough back to see clearly. That woman had survived by being stubborn and paying attention and refusing at every single point to accept someone else's valuation of her. She'd been fortunate in some of the pieces. Nora's letters, Dobbs' wagon, the federal case that was already being built. She'd been wrong about a few things. She'd been scared more often than she'd showed. She'd cried once, alone in her room above the laundry on a night when everything felt very large and very uncertain, and then gotten up and washed her face and gone back to work. That was the truth of it. Not heroism, just stubbornness applied consistently over time in a direction that mattered. She thought about what that cost and what it was worth, and whether, if she'd known on the coach what was waiting in Black Hollow, she would have come anyway. She thought, yes, not because I'm brave, because there was nowhere else to go that would have been better, and because I am, at bottom, a person who needs to do something with what she has. The afternoon light hit the main street at an angle, turning the dust gold, making even the bone-colored buildings look like something a person could choose to live among. Jace was warm beside her on the bench. The coffee was bad, and she was almost finished with it. "Next week I need to go to Harrow," she said. "The circuit court has the Okariki files, and I need to review them in person." "How long?" 2 days? Maybe 3? "I'll go with you," he said. She looked at him sidelong. He was looking at the street, unremarkable, like he'd said something about the weather. "You don't need to," she said. "I know," he said. "I want to." She looked back at the street. A dog crossed from one side to the other with the purposeful trot of a dog who has somewhere to be, and a child ran out of a doorway and then back in again, and the wagon with the family on it had turned the corner and was gone. "All right," she said. She finished the coffee. It was terrible. She'd had it 100 times now, and it had not improved, and she kept drinking it, which said something about habits and comfort and the way certain things become yours, not because they're good, but because they're there and you've grown around them. She set the cup down on the bench between them. The woman who had been auctioned in this street, who had stood on a crate and been priced and found the price absurd and decided to make it everyone else's problem, was sitting on a bench outside a dry goods store on a Tuesday afternoon with work to do tomorrow and a person beside her who'd chosen to stay. That wasn't the ending anyone would have written for her that first day. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't finished. The land cases were ongoing, the circuit court was slow, Holt still turned his hat, and there were mornings when Clara woke up in the room above the laundry. She'd kept the room. It was hers. She'd paid for it 100 times over, and felt the weight of how much was still undone. But she was here. She had chosen to be here, and that choice, made every morning without ceremony or applause, was the only thing she'd ever had full ownership of. She stood up from the bench. "Come on," she said to Jace. "I need to look at a contract before it gets dark." He stood up without complaint, the way a man stands up when he's made his decision about someone and doesn't need to keep revisiting it. They walked back down the main street of Black Hollow together. Not side by side like something out of a painting, but the way people actually walk, slightly off pace, adjusting for each other without thinking about it. And the town went on around them, imperfect and ongoing in theirs, in the way that places become yours, not when they welcome you, but when you refuse to leave.